In 1971, a psychologist locked 24 ordinary college students in a fake prison in a Stanford basement. Within days, the guards were allegedly torturing the prisoners, the study spiraled out of control, and it was shut down after just 6 days instead of the planned 2 weeks. For 50 years, this has been taught as definitive proof that any of us, given a uniform and a little power, will turn cruel. But new evidence, including the researchers' own original audio tapes, tells a very different story. And it changes what this experiment actually proves about human nature. Stick around, because the real story is honestly more unsettling than the myth. Let's start with the legend, because it's one of the most famous stories in psychology. Stanford professor Philip Zimbardo recruited 24 male college students through a newspaper ad offering $15 a day for a study on prison life. He randomly assigned half to be guards, half to be prisoners, and converted a university basement hallway into a makeshift jail, complete with cells, a solitary confinement closet, and one-way observation. The plan was to run the simulation for 2 weeks and observe how the roles shaped behavior. What happened instead became legend. Within 36 hours, one prisoner had a breakdown so severe he had to be released. Guards escalated quickly, forcing prisoners to do humiliating tasks, stripping privileges, using psychological punishment. By day 5, Zimbardo himself, who was playing the role of prison superintendent, said he'd become so absorbed in the simulation that he nearly lost sight of the fact it was research at all. His girlfriend at the time, a young psychologist named Christina Maslach, visited, was horrified by what she saw and reportedly convinced him to shut it down. Day 6. Study over. The conclusion Zimbardo drew, and the one that made this the most cited psychology study of all time, was that the situation, not individual character, is what turns good people evil. Put anyone in a position of unchecked power, he argued, and cruelty isn't a possibility, it's close to inevitable. He later expanded this into a book called The Lucifer Effect and testified as an expert witness using this framework, including in the Abu Ghraib prisoner abuse case. Here's where the story starts to crack. In 2018, a French sociologist named Thibault Letexier got access to Zimbardo's original archive materials at Stanford, including something almost nobody had reviewed closely, the audio recordings of orientation meetings before the experiment even began. On those tapes, a staff member coordinating the guards, not a random participant, an actual member of the research team, is heard explicitly coaching them on how to behave. He tells them to be tough, to make prisoners feel a sense of powerlessness, and outline specific tactics to use. This wasn't guards spontaneously discovering cruelty under the pressure of the situation. They were, at least in part, given a script and told to perform it. It gets more complicated. Several former participants have since come forward, most notably a prisoner identified as Douglas Corpy, whose dramatic breakdown on day 1 became one of the study's most cited moments, and said in later interviews that they were, in his words, acting. Corpy has said he faked his breakdown specifically because he wanted to leave to study for a graduate exam, and once he realized he couldn't simply quit, dramatic distress seemed like the fastest way out. Other participants have described feeling pressure to play their assigned role convincingly, in some cases because they knew they were being watched and evaluated, not because the situation was organically transforming them. So the picture that emerges from the archives isn't spontaneous moral collapse. It's a mix of explicit coaching, participant performance, and a research team, led by Zimbardo himself, actively playing a role as superintendent that wasn't neutrally observing so much as directing the outcome it expected to find. Critics, including several psychologists who've since re-examined the study, argue it wasn't a controlled experiment at all in the scientific sense. There was no control group, the sample was tiny, participants weren't randomly drawn from a general population, and the person running it was also a participant in the drama, not an outside observer. This is also why the Stanford Prison Experiment has never been successfully replicated in its original form, and not for lack of trying. A 2002 BBC-funded replication called the BBC Prison Study, run by psychologists Alex Haslam and Steve Riker, used a similar setup but without coaching participants on how to behave. The guards in that version did not spontaneously become cruel. Instead, several described feeling uncomfortable with their authority and reluctant to assert it. The prisoners, meanwhile, banded together and effectively organized more cohesively than the guards. The results were different enough that Haslam and Reicher published an entirely separate theory to explain it. Their explanation, called social identity theory, argues that Zimbardo had the core idea partly right but the mechanism wrong. People don't turn cruel just because they're handed power. They turn cruel when they strongly identify with a group role, believe that role has a legitimate cause, and are actively encouraged explicitly or through subtle cues from an authority figure to act a certain way. Power alone, without that identification and encouragement, tends to produce hesitation and discomfort, not tyranny. The guards in the BBC study, left without coaching or a clear ideological framework for their role, largely didn't want the job. This distinction matters far beyond psychology textbooks. It shows up in how militaries and prison systems actually study abuse of power today. The common thread in documented cases of institutional cruelty isn't simply that authority corrupts. It's authority combined with explicit or implied permission from the top, a strong in-group identity, and dehumanizing language about the other side. Remove any one of those ingredients, and the same power imbalance often does not produce the same result, which gives us a more precise and more actionable takeaway than the original myth. The lesson isn't that anyone would become a monster given the chance, a conclusion that can feel almost like an excuse for cruelty. The real finding is narrower and more useful. Cruelty tends to emerge when people in power are given explicit or implicit permission to dehumanize the people below them, and are made to feel that doing so serves some larger legitimate purpose, which means the actual safeguard isn't hoping people have good character. It's removing the permission and the ideology that makes cruelty feel justified in the first place, through oversight, accountability, and refusing to let dehumanizing language become normal in institutions. Zimbardo's basement didn't prove that ordinary people are secretly monsters waiting for a costume. It proved something narrower and arguably scarier, that with the right coaching, the right framing, and permission from someone in charge, ordinary people can be walked into cruelty far faster than most of us would like to believe, and that the same is true, in reverse, of resisting it. Next time on the study files, we're looking at the Milgram obedience experiments and the detail about how the shocks were staged that almost never makes it into the popular retelling. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and let me know in the comments, do you think you'd have been a guard or a prisoner?